The cold autumn wind whistled through the open windows of Harvard Observatory as Thomas Blackwood adjusted his telescope. The stars shone brightly on this October night in 1896, and he hoped to complete his study of the Andromeda constellation. At 45 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Thomas had spent more than half his life studying the night sky. He breathed warm air onto his cold hands and rubbed them together. The night was quiet except for the soft clicking of Mary Franklin's pencil as she wrote in her notebook at the desk behind him. Mary was one of the few female astronomers at Harvard, and Thomas considered her the most careful note-taker he had ever worked with. "Mary, would you hand me the star chart from last week?" Thomas asked, not taking his eye from the telescope's eyepiece. "Of course, Professor Blackwood," she said, walking over with the chart. But before she could hand it to him, Thomas's body went stiff. "Good Lord," he whispered. "Mary, come look at this. Quickly." Mary hurried to the telescope. Through the lens, she saw something that made her gasp. A large, dark shape moved across the star field. It wasn't like anything she had ever seen before. Not a comet, not a meteor, and certainly not a hot air balloon. It's moving against the wind," Thomas said, his voice shaking. The object was cigar-shaped, maybe 300 feet long, with strange lights along its sides. It moved with purpose, making sharp turns that should have been impossible for any known flying machine. "We must record this," Mary said. She ran to get her camera, but her hands trembled so much she almost dropped it. By the time she set it up, the strange craft had moved to a different part of the sky. Thomas quickly wrote down everything he could see: the object's size, speed, and the way it seemed to glow with a faint blue light. Mary sketched the shape in her notebook, trying to capture every detail she could see through the telescope. The mysterious airship stayed visible for exactly 7 minutes before it shot straight up into the sky and vanished, moving faster than any human-made object could fly. Did that really happen?" Mary asked, looking at her sketch. "We both saw it," Thomas said firmly. "And we're going to report it." The next morning, they took their evidence to the head of the astronomy department, Professor Wilson. He sat behind his big wooden desk, looking at them over his round glasses as they showed him their notes and Mary's drawings. "A flying ship," he said, frowning, "moving faster than a train and glowing blue. Perhaps you both worked too late last night." "Sir, we know what we saw," Thomas said. "We're scientists. We took careful notes. The object made movements that nothing on Earth can make." Professor Wilson shook his head. "If I report this to the university board, they'll think we've all gone mad. Flying ships, impossible turns, blue glowing lights. No, this won't do at all." But Thomas and Mary wouldn't give up. They wrote letters to other observatories, asking if anyone else had seen something strange in the sky. They also sent a report to the local newspaper, the Boston Globe. 3 days later, the newspaper printed their story, but not on the front page. Instead, it was tucked away on page 12, next to advertisements for tooth powder and women's corsets. The headline read, "Harvard astronomers claim to see mystery airship. Too much time in the stars." The story spread quickly through Boston. Some people laughed at them. Students at Harvard made jokes about Blackwood's blue ghost. Even other scientists smiled and shook their heads when Thomas and Mary walked by. But then the letters started arriving. First one, then 3, then dozens. Letters from people all over Massachusetts who had seen strange lights in the sky. A farmer in Worcester who saw a huge shadow pass over his fields at night. A fisherman in Plymouth who spotted a glowing object dive into the ocean and come back out again. Thomas pinned a map on his office wall and marked each sighting with a red dot. Soon the map had 37 dots, making a clear path across the state. "They can laugh all they want," he told Mary as they added another dot to the map. "But something is up there, something not from this Earth, and we're going to prove it." That night, they went back to the observatory. They had a feeling this was just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could imagine. Robert Hayes sat at his telegraph desk in Chicago's main post office, his fingers tapping out messages as they had done for the past 15 years. The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m., and the night shift was usually quiet. But tonight was different. Strange signals had been coming through his telegraph machine for the past hour. At first, he thought it was just static or interference from the recent electrical storm. But these signals were different. They had a pattern, yet they didn't match any Morse code he knew. Tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 long pause, tap, over and over. Robert wiped his forehead with his handkerchief and wrote down the strange pattern again. His small office was lit by a single gas lamp, and its light flickered across the papers spread across his desk. 20 years as a telegraph operator, and he had never seen anything like this. The next morning, he walked into the office of the Chicago Daily Tribune. The newspaper's office was busy, with the clacking of typewriters and the smell of fresh ink in the air. He asked to speak to someone about his strange signals, and that's how he met Elizabeth Turner. Elizabeth was 30 years old, with quick eyes and a notebook always ready in her hand. Most newspapers didn't hire women reporters, but Elizabeth had proved herself by uncovering stories that male reporters had missed. When Robert showed her his notes, her eyes lit up. "And you say these signals started last night?" she asked, looking at his careful drawings of the pattern. "Yes, but that's not all," Robert said. He pulled out more papers from his bag. "I talked to other telegraph operators. Bill in Detroit got the same signals. So did Pete in Cleveland and Jack in Milwaukee, all at the same time." Elizabeth drew a quick map in her notebook, marking the cities. Could it be some kind of prank? Robert shook his head. No way to fake signals in 4 cities at once. And here's the strange part. Look at the dates. He showed her a newspaper clipping about the Harvard astronomers who had seen a strange flying machine. The date matched the first appearance of the signals. "There's more," Robert said. He laid out more newspaper stories from different cities. Each one talked about people seeing strange lights or flying machines in the sky, and each sighting happened on the same nights as the strange signals. Elizabeth stood up from her desk. "Mr. Hayes, would you like to help me investigate a story?" For the next week, they worked together. Elizabeth wrote to other newspapers, asking about similar reports. Robert talked to more telegraph operators. They created a big map, marking each place where people saw the mysterious airships and where the strange signals appeared. One night, as they worked late in the newspaper office, Robert's hands began to shake. "Listen," he said. The telegraph machine in the corner of the room was clicking. The same pattern he had heard before. Tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 long pause, tap. Elizabeth grabbed her coat. "Quick, let's get to the roof." They ran up 4 flights of stairs and burst out onto the roof of the Tribune building. The cold night air hit their faces as they looked up at the sky. And there it was, a huge dark shape moving silently above Chicago's streets. Blue lights glowed along its sides, just like the Harvard astronomers had described. "Do you have your camera?" Robert whispered. Elizabeth was already setting it up. "If we can get a picture." But before she could take the photograph, something even stranger happened. The telegraph pattern changed. Now it was coming faster, with a different rhythm. And at the same moment, the lights on the mysterious ship began to pulse in the same pattern. "It's not random signals," Robert said, his voice filled with awe. "They're trying to talk to us." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she wrote in her notebook. "But who are they? And what do they want?" The huge ship moved slowly across Chicago's sky, its lights still pulsing in time with the telegraph signals. Down below, other people were coming out of their houses, pointing up at the strange sight. But only Robert and Elizabeth knew that this wasn't just a mysterious airship, it was trying to communicate. As the ship disappeared into the night clouds, Elizabeth turned to Robert. "We need to find someone who can help us understand these signals. And I think I know just who to talk to. Those Harvard astronomers who first saw the ship." Robert nodded, still staring at the sky. Whatever this is, it's bigger than anything we could have imagined. James Cooper walked along the railroad tracks outside of Omaha, Nebraska, checking for any damage after the previous night's storm. The morning sun was bright, and his boots crunched on the gravel between the wooden ties. As the head engineer for this section of the Union Pacific Railroad, it was his job to make sure the tracks were safe. Something shiny caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a piece of scrap metal from a train. But as he got closer, he noticed this metal looked different. It had a strange, silvery blue color that he had never seen before. James picked up the piece of metal. It was light, much lighter than steel, but he couldn't bend it no matter how hard he tried. More pieces lay scattered around the tracks, as if something had dropped them from above. "Well, that's mighty strange," he said to himself. He put the pieces in his tool bag and kept walking. A few minutes later, he found something even stranger. A perfect circle burned into the ground next to the tracks, about 10 feet wide. The grass around it wasn't burned, just the dirt inside the circle. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table, studying the metal pieces under his oil lamp. His wife Betty watched as he tried to scratch the metal with a file, but the file couldn't leave a mark. "I'm going to send pieces to some universities," he said. "This isn't any kind of metal I've ever worked with, and I've been on the railroad for 20 years. James wrote letters to 3 universities, Yale, Harvard, and the University of Nebraska. He wrapped small pieces of the metal carefully in cloth and mailed them the next day. 2 weeks later, he received an urgent telegram from Professor William Barrett at Yale. "Metal samples, Rory CIVD, most extraordinary, coming to Omaha MMEDA, Eli. Please wait for my arrival." Professor Barrett arrived 3 days later on the morning train. He was a tall man with a thick mustache and carrying a large bag full of scientific equipment. James took him to the spot where he had found the metal. "Mr. Cooper," Professor Barrett said, setting up strange instruments around the burned circle, "what you found is impossible." "What do you mean, impossible?" James asked. "I tested the metal in our laboratory," the professor explained, writing numbers in his notebook. "It's lighter than aluminum, but stronger than steel. It doesn't rust. It doesn't conduct electricity like normal metal. And most strange of all, it seems to get colder when we heat it." James watched as the professor took more measurements. "So where did it come from?" "That's the real question, isn't it?" Professor Barrett stood up and looked at the sky. "Have you heard about the airship sightings? The strange lights people have been seeing?" James nodded. Everyone had been talking about the mysterious flying machines. "Well," the professor continued, "I believe this metal came from one of those ships. And if I'm right, then these ships weren't built in any factory on Earth." Just then, they heard a loud humming sound from above. Both men looked up to see a large, dark shape moving across the sky. It was much higher than any balloon could fly, and it moved too fast to be any known flying machine. "Quick! Your camera!" Professor Barrett shouted. James grabbed the camera from their equipment bag, but his hands were shaking. By the time he got it ready, the shape had disappeared behind the clouds. "Did you see how it moved?" the professor asked excitedly. "No wings, no balloon, no propeller. It's using some kind of power we don't understand." That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the strange metal and the ship in the sky. The next morning, he sent telegrams to the Harvard astronomers and the Chicago newspaper office. He had heard they were also investigating the mysterious airships. 3 days later, he received replies from both places. They wanted to meet. Something big was happening, and now James was part of it. "We're going to need a bigger sample of that metal," Professor Barrett told him. "And we need to find out where these ships are going. They're not just flying around randomly. They're looking for something." James nodded, looking at the strange metal pieces on his desk. "Or maybe," he said quietly, "they're trying to show us something." Michael Reynolds straightened his tie as he walked into the Treasury Department building in Washington, D.C. Although his badge said he was a normal Treasury agent, his real job was much more interesting. The government had secretly asked him to look into the strange airship sightings happening across the country. Today, he was meeting someone who might have real proof of these mysterious craft. Dorothy Wells was a photographer from Pennsylvania who had taken several clear pictures of something unusual in the sky. She sat in his office now, a sturdy camera bag on her lap. "Thank you for coming, Miss Wells," Michael said, closing his office door. "I understand you have some photographs to show me." Dorothy nodded. She was in her early 30s, with practical clothes and calm eyes that missed nothing. She opened her bag and took out several photographic plates wrapped carefully in cloth. "I've been taking pictures of the night sky for 5 years," she said, laying the plates on his desk. "But I'd never seen anything like this until 3 months ago." Michael held the first plate up to the light. The image showed a large, cigar-shaped object with strange lights along its side. It was the clearest picture he had ever seen of the mysterious airships. "How did you get such clear shots?" he asked. "I modified my camera to take pictures in low light," Dorothy explained. "And I was ready. I had seen the ship 3 nights in a row, always following the same path." Michael looked at more plates. Each one showed the same ship from different angles. In one picture, it was close enough to see strange markings on its side. "Have you shown these to anyone else?" he asked. "Only the local newspaper," Dorothy said. "But they wouldn't print them. They said the pictures must be fake." Michael nodded slowly. He had seen this pattern before. Newspapers across the country were refusing to print clear evidence of the airships. Someone was making sure these stories stayed quiet. Just then, his office telephone rang. When he answered it, the voice on the other end spoke quickly. "Agent Reynolds, there's been another sighting. This time over the White House itself." Michael put down the phone and looked at Dorothy. "Would you like to help me investigate something?" That evening, they sat in a hidden spot on the roof of the Treasury building, Dorothy's camera ready. The sun had just set, and the first stars were appearing in the sky. "Look there," Dorothy whispered, pointing toward the west. A dark shape moved silently across the sky, bigger than any balloon and moving faster than any known aircraft. Dorothy's camera clicked rapidly as she took picture after picture. Michael wrote in his notebook, noting the time, direction, and speed of the object, but something bothered him. This sighting seemed too perfect, almost like, "It's showing itself on purpose," he said suddenly. "They want us to see them here, over the Capitol." Dorothy lowered her camera. "But why?" Before Michael could answer, a messenger boy ran up to the roof. "Agent Reynolds, urgent telegram for you." The message was from Chicago, something about strange telegraph signals. Another message followed quickly from Harvard about mysterious metal fragments, and a third from a railroad engineer in Nebraska. "Miss Wells," Michael said, reading the messages, "I think we need to take a train ride. There are other people investigating these ships, and we need to talk to them." But as they left the roof, neither of them noticed the man watching from the shadows. He wrote in a small notebook of his own, then disappeared into the night. 2 days later, when Michael checked his office files on the airship sightings, half of them were missing. Someone in Washington didn't want this mystery solved. "They can hide the files," he told Dorothy as they boarded the train to Chicago. "But they can't hide what's up there in the sky, and we're going to find out what it is." Dorothy patted her camera back. "And this time, we'll have proof that even they can't make disappear." Linda Howard stood in front of the large map that covered an entire wall of her classroom in Kansas City. School had ended hours ago, but she wasn't thinking about teaching right now. Her mind was focused on the dozens of red pins stuck into the map, each one marking a reported airship sighting. As a mathematics teacher, Linda knew that numbers could tell stories, and these pins were telling her something important. She just had to figure out what it was. She stepped back and looked at her notebook. For weeks, she had been collecting every newspaper story about the mysterious airships. She wrote down the dates, times, and places of each sighting. Now she was sure she saw a pattern. "It's like a dance," she whispered to herself. "They're moving in circles, but each circle is exactly the same size." The quiet of the empty school was broken by a knock at her classroom door. Linda turned to see two men in dark suits standing there. "Miss Howard," one of them said. "We're from Washington. We'd like to talk about your research." Linda's heart beat faster. She had sent letters about her findings to several scientists, but she never expected the government to show up at her door. "Come in," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just working on the pattern." The men looked at her map. The younger one introduced himself as Agent Michael Reynolds, and he seemed genuinely interested. The older man didn't give his name and stayed near the door. "Tell us about this pattern you found," Agent Reynolds said. Linda pointed to the map. "Look here, each sighting happens exactly 313 miles from the last one. The ships move in perfect circles, and each circle takes exactly 7 days to complete." She showed them her calculations, and see these points where the circles cross. "Every time the ships reach one of these crossing points, we get reports of strange lights or signals." Agent Reynolds studied her notes carefully. The older man by the door shifted uncomfortably. "There's more," Linda said, pulling out more papers. "I mapped the heights of the ships when people saw them. They fly higher over cities and lower over empty land. It's not random. They're following a mathematical formula." Just then, they heard footsteps in the hallway. A woman with a camera bag appeared at the door, followed by a man in a railroad uniform, and two people Linda recognized from newspaper photos. The Harvard astronomers. "Sorry we're late," the woman said. "The train from Chicago was delayed. I'm Dorothy Wells, and these are Thomas Blackwood, Mary Franklin, and James Cooper." Linda looked at all these people she had read about in the newspapers. They had all been investigating different parts of the mystery, and now they were here in her classroom. "Show them the pattern," Agent Reynolds said. As Linda explained her discoveries again, the others added their own pieces to the puzzle. The telegraph signals matched the crossing points on her map. The metal fragments were found exactly at the center of one of the circles. The clearest photographs were all taken at the highest points of the ship's paths. "It's a survey," Thomas Blackwood said suddenly. "They're mapping something." "But what?" Mary Franklin asked. "They must know more about Earth than we do. What are they looking for?" Before anyone could answer, the older man who hadn't given his name stepped forward. "I'm afraid this meeting is over. Miss Howard, all of your research materials are now property of the United States government." But Linda was ready for this. She smiled and pulled a folder from her desk. "You can take what's here," she said, "but I have copies of everything in a safe place. And I found something else in the numbers, something big. The ships aren't just mapping. They're counting down to something." The older man's face turned pale. Outside the classroom windows, the sun was setting, and somewhere up there, Linda knew, the mysterious ships were still following their perfect mathematical dance across the sky. Frank Miller wiped sweat from his forehead as he adjusted the dials on his radio equipment. His basement workshop in Street Lewis was hot and cramped, filled with electrical equipment he had built himself. As one of the few private radio operators in America, he had spent years experimenting with different ways to send and receive signals. The group gathered in his workshop watched him closely. Thomas and Mary from Harvard, Robert the telegraph operator, Elizabeth the reporter, James the railroad engineer, Dorothy with her camera, Agent Reynolds, and Linda the mathematics teacher. They had all come because of his latest discovery. "I found something in those telegraph signals you showed me," Frank told them, turning a large brass dial. They weren't random. They were parts of a larger pattern, broken up into pieces. His radio equipment hummed and crackled. Unlike normal radio sets, Frank had built this one to pick up many different types of signals at once. "Last night," he continued, "I put all the pieces together and sent the complete pattern back into the sky. And something answered. The room went quiet except for the soft hum of the machines. Frank turned another dial, and strange sounds filled the room. It wasn't Morse code or any normal radio signal. It was more like music, but with a pattern that repeated over and over. "Listen to this part," Frank said, adjusting the frequency. The sound changed to a series of clicks and hums that seemed to form words, though not in any language they knew. Linda Howard stepped forward, her notebook in hand. "The pattern matches the mathematical sequence I found. It's the same numbers, but turned into sound." Just then, all the electrical equipment in the room began to glow brighter. The radio's hum grew louder, and new sounds came through the speakers, clicks and whistles that followed a clear rhythm. "It's answering us," Frank whispered. He grabbed a pencil and began writing down the pattern of sounds. Thomas Blackwood looked at the pattern. "The sequence, it's prime numbers. They're sending us prime numbers, just like the ones we use in mathematics." Mary Franklin checked his work. "He's right. Look, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17. They're showing us they understand mathematics." Frank turned more dials, and the signals became clearer. Now they could hear what sounded like their own radio signals being played back to them, but changed slightly, as if someone was correcting them. "They're teaching us how to talk to them," Frank said, his voice full of excitement. "Each time we send a signal, they send it back, but better, stronger." Dorothy Wells set up her camera to photograph the glowing equipment. Agent Reynolds wrote everything down in his notebook. Elizabeth Turner's pencil flew across her notepad as she took notes for her newspaper story. James Cooper pulled out one of the strange metal pieces he had found. As the signals grew stronger, the metal began to glow with a faint blue light, just like the ships they had seen in the sky. Suddenly, the radio crackled with a new sound. Through the static, they heard something that made them all freeze. Numbers being spoken in a clear human voice, but with a strange accent no one had ever heard before. 1, 2, 3, 4. "It's counting," Linda said, "just like the pattern I found. It's counting down to something." The voice continued, but now it was saying something else. Words in English, broken and strange, but clear enough to understand. "We come in 7 days." Frank's hands shook as he wrote down the words. 7 days until what? Agent Reynolds looked at the group. "We need to tell Washington about this. But they'll try to stop us, just like they tried to take my research." Linda finished. "Then we don't tell Washington," Elizabeth said firmly. "Not yet. We have 7 days to figure out what's really going on. 7 days to prepare for whoever or whatever is up there." Outside, the night sky was clear and full of stars. Somewhere up there, the mysterious ships were still moving in their perfect patterns, preparing for something that would change the world forever. 3 days had passed since the radio contact, and the group worked without rest in Frank Miller's basement. They had turned it into their headquarters, with maps covering the walls and tables full of equipment. Linda's mathematical patterns were pinned next to Dorothy's photographs, while James's strange metal pieces sat near Frank's radio gear. Thomas Blackwood burst into the room, waving an old book. "I found something," he said, his voice excited. "In the Harvard Library archives. Look at this." He opened the book to show yellowed pages filled with drawings. They showed strange flying machines, much like the ones they had been seeing. The book was dated 1847. "These aren't the first sightings," Mary Franklin said, studying the drawings. "They'd been visiting Earth for a long time." Elizabeth Turner spread out old newspapers she had collected. "Look at these stories. Strange lights in the sky during the Civil War. Flying ships seen during the California Gold Rush. They'd been watching us grow as a nation." Agent Reynolds pulled out more files he had secretly copied from Washington. "There's more. Every major technological breakthrough in the last 50 years, there were sighting reports just before each one. The telegraph, electricity, radio. They'd been guiding us," Linda said softly. "Teaching us, step by step. each new invention coming just when we were ready for it. Frank adjusted his radio equipment as new signals came in. The strange voice they had heard before spoke again, clearer this time. "Humans ready now. Long watch ending. Time to meet." Robert Hayes, who had been studying the telegraph patterns, looked up. "The signals are changing. They're not just over America anymore. They're coming from all over the world." Dorothy's camera flashed as she took pictures of the glowing radio dials. The strange metal pieces on the table had started humming, giving off a soft blue light. 4 days left, James Cooper said, checking his pocket watch. But what happens then? Linda walked to the big map on the wall. "Look at the pattern now. All the circles are getting smaller, moving toward one point." She pointed to a spot in the middle of the United States. "That's where they'll land," Thomas said. "But why choose us? Why Earth?" Just then, Agent Reynolds got an urgent telegram. His face went pale as he read it. "Washington knows," he said. "They're sending soldiers to that landing spot. They think it's an invasion." "But it's not," Mary said. "Can't they see? The visitors have had hundreds of years to attack if they wanted to. They've only helped us grow." Elizabeth grabbed her notebook. "We need to tell people the truth. I'll write the story." "They won't print it," Robert interrupted. "Remember how they ignored the early sightings?" Frank raised his hand for quiet. The radio was speaking again. "Humanity's children, long separate, time to rejoin." Linda's eyes went wide. She ran to her calculations, flipping through pages of numbers. "That's it. The pattern isn't just mathematics. It's DNA. They're showing us our connection to them." Thomas and Mary looked at her work. "She's right," Mary whispered. "These aren't alien patterns. They're human patterns, just much more advanced. They're not invaders. They're our ancestors," Thomas finished. "Or at least, they're connected to our past somehow." Agent Reynolds stood up. "We have 4 days to stop the Army from making a horrible mistake. 4 days to tell the world the truth." "But how?" James asked. "Who would believe us?" Dorothy held up her camera. "We have proof. Pictures, metal, signals, mathematics, evidence that can't be ignored." "And we have each other," Elizabeth added. 8 different people from different walks of life, all seeing the same truth. The radio hummed again, and the voice spoke one last time that night. "Prepare for return. Family reunion soon." They looked at each other in the blue light of the humming metal. In 4 days, the world would change forever. The only question was, would humanity be ready for the truth about its own history? The sun rose on the final day. In a flat field in Kansas, soldiers set up a line of guns pointed at the sky. But nearby, hidden in an old barn, 8 people prepared to change history. "The ships are coming," Linda Howard said, checking her calculations one last time. "All the patterns point to noon today." Frank Miller's radio equipment hummed steadily. Dorothy Wells adjusted her cameras while Elizabeth Turner prepared her notes. Thomas Blackwood and Mary Franklin watched the sky through their telescopes. James Cooper held the glowing metal pieces, which now pulsed with a bright blue light. Robert Hayes listened to his portable telegraph, monitoring Army messages. Agent Michael Reynolds paced nervously. "The Army won't wait," Reynolds said. "They have orders to fire as soon as anything appears in the sky." "Then we have to stop them," Elizabeth said firmly. She pulled out copies of their evidence, hundreds of pages they had secretly printed. "Every newspaper in the country will get these by tomorrow. The truth can't be hidden anymore." Suddenly, Frank's radio crackled. The now familiar voice spoke. "We arrive soon. Prepare for meeting." Thomas looked up from his telescope. "They're coming. 3 ships, high up, moving in a triangle pattern." The Army spotted them too. They could hear shouts from the field as soldiers ran to their positions. A bugle sounded, calling more troops to the line. "We have to do something now," Mary said. Agent Reynolds straightened his tie and stood up. "I'll talk to the commander. Show him what we found." "We're coming with you," Linda said, gathering their proof. The others nodded. They walked out of the barn together, into the morning sun. The ships were clearly visible now, 3 huge silver shapes descending slowly from the sky. They moved with perfect grace, making no sound. The Army commander, a gray-haired man named General Wilson, watched them approach through binoculars. When Agent Reynolds showed him his government badge, the general listened to their story. Ancestors, hidden guides. The general shook his head. "Sounds like fairy tales to me." But then Linda showed him her mathematical proof. Dorothy's clear photographs came next. James displayed the strange metal that now glowed brighter than ever. Frank's radio picked up signals that matched Linda's patterns exactly. The ships came lower, and soldiers gripped their rifles nervously. But General Wilson kept looking at the evidence. "If you're wrong," he said finally, "you'll all be arrested for interfering with the Army." "And if we're right," Thomas said, "you'll be the man who helped humanity meet its lost family." The general was quiet for a long moment. The ships were very close now, their blue lights pulsing in rhythm with the humming metal pieces. Finally, he turned to his men. "Stand down. All units stand down." The soldiers lowered their guns, looking confused but relieved. The 3 ships descended the last few hundred feet and stopped, hovering just above the ground. A door opened in the side of the largest ship. Light poured out, and a ramp extended down to the earth. A figure appeared in the doorway. Tall, human-like, but surrounded by a soft blue glow. "Hello, children of Earth," it said in perfect English. "We have waited a long time for this day." The figure walked down the ramp. Up close, it looked almost human, but with a strange, ageless quality. It carried a small box that glowed with the same blue light as the metal pieces. "We left Earth long ago," the figure said, "when humanity was young. We watched you grow, helped when we could, waited until you were ready. Now we offer you a choice." It opened the box, revealing complex machines unlike anything they had ever seen. "We can give you all our knowledge now. Cure your diseases, end your wars, take you to the stars. Or we can continue as we have, guiding you slowly, letting you find your own path. The choice must be yours." The 8 people who had solved the mystery looked at each other. They had found the truth about the airships, but now they faced an even bigger question. What should humanity's future be? As the sun reached its highest point, they prepared to make a decision that would change the world forever.